Hello, this is UCL Uncovering Politics, and this week we're looking at public preferences on taxes and spending. What do people want? Indeed, do people have clear preferences at all? Hello, my name is Alan Rinnick, and welcome to UCL Uncovering Politics, the podcast of the School of Public Policy and Department of Political Science at University College London. Few issues in public policy are as important as the size of the state. How much should states spend? How much, therefore, should it raise in taxes? And what exactly should it spend this money on? In a democracy, we expect policymakers to be responsive to public opinion in answering such questions. But what exactly do the public want? Indeed, to what extent do most of us even have meaningful preferences that take account of unavoidable trade-offs between different priorities? Such questions have long challenged political scientists, but a new paper just published by three of my colleagues here in the UCL Department of Political Science offers a new approach to measuring such preferences and some intriguing answers on what people want. Those colleagues are Lucy Barnes, Jack Blumenau and Ben Lauderdale, and I'm delighted to say that two of them join me now to discuss the paper. Dr. Lucy Barnes is Associate Professor in Comparative Politics and our Deputy Head of Department, and Ben Lauderdale is Professor of Political Science and Head of Department in the UCL Department of Political Science. Welcome to you both, Lucy and Ben. And Lucy, let's start with the background to your work. Why is it difficult to measure public preferences on public spending?
Good question, Alan, and thank you very much for having us on the podcast. It's a good question because we might think, this is pretty easy. Almost every week, ministers announce something, some initiative that they want to spend money on, whether it's retention bonuses for care workers, and people read the papers and they have some kind of opinion that we shouldn't be spending money on this, or we should be spending much more. And so in that sense, you think, it should be pretty easy and we can just ask people what they think. But when you think about public spending more broadly, we have to take into account that there are literally thousands of such spending outlay going on in government at any time. And at some point, the whole budget has to add up. And it has to be paid for out of taxation or out of borrowing, although that's not something that we've looked at in this paper. So the overall question is about spending, but really in a trade-off. Do you want to pay care workers more if that has the consequence of higher taxation or less money for other priorities like teachers or R&D or transport? And so the budgeting spending task is actually really, really complicated. And what we think is that people probably still do have opinions about it, but it's slightly more difficult to get at them because those opinions aren't over a fully worked out budget. We're not wandering around. Even the listeners of this podcast, who I think are probably highly sophisticated, politically engaged types, are not wandering around with a fully itemized budget of exactly how much we should be spending across all of those different kind of priorities, all those different tasks that governments might be endeavoring to do. And we wanted to get at the kind of preferences that people do have when faced with these kind of realistic trade-offs. So it's not just, do you want more spending? Just a question a little bit like asking me, do you want more ice cream? Because the answer is always going to be yes. And it's only when I realize that I don't have room for steak and ice cream at the same time that I start to adapt that kind of reaction. And so previous work has often been more focused on specific policies where, if I care a lot about the politics of unemployment insurance, I will ask people what they think about unemployment insurance, but that doesn't build in that kind of trade-off. And then there's been some other recent work on interactive budgeting tasks where essentially we can ask people, we know you don't really have this fully worked out budget in your head, but now try and create one, and through a nice little internet task, you can get people to fill out an entire budget, and that has been done recently. But our view is that this is actually very difficult for people to do, and possibly not really representative of the kinds of preferences that might be politically relevant. Because that's like we said, that's not what people are wandering around with in their minds. And so what we have wanted to try and do with this recent paper is to take a kind of intermediate path where we keep the realism, but we make the questions that we ask a little bit more accessible, a little bit more similar to the kind of judgments people might be plausibly expected to have in their heads.
Interesting. Great. Thank you. So before we get into the detail of just what methods you've employed here, let's just explore a little bit further what it is you're trying to find in people's heads. So, Ben, Lucy mentioned there that none of us, or very few of us at least, go around with kind of itemized lists of what we want to be spent on different things. And what have political scientists said and found out previously about whether people actually have clear preferences at all on these kinds of questions?
Yeah, this is a really important question, and thank you for having us on the podcast. So there's a very long tradition of scholars of political science, of public opinion in particular, being very skeptical about whether most people have real views about most political questions. This is typically associated with the Michigan School, which emerged at the University of Michigan in the US in the early 1960s. And a lot of that work was based on early iterations of the American National Election Study, which showed that people's views often were only weakly related to one another across issues and were often very unstable over time. So you'd ask people the same question one year, and then you come back to them a couple of years later, and looking across everyone, there was only a very weak relationship between what they said in 1958 and what they said in 1960. And that kind of result has generally held up in a lot of subsequent research, although it does depend a lot on what kind of issue you're asking people about. There is substantial variation in the extent to which people seem to have real stable views. It's important to recognize this is understandable. Why would people form views on questions that they will never directly be asked about by the political system? People tend to have stable views about what parties they prefer and vote for. That's a question that is asked of them by the political system regularly. But people have lots to do. Most people don't find politics very interesting. And so why would they have a view, a standing view on a niche political issue or even a fairly high profile political issue if it doesn't come up directly in their lives? And so the implication of this is that for the area we're studying is that people are unlikely to have fully worked out views about the public budget. As Lucy said, no one's walking around with that standing view on how many billions should be spent on the NHS and how many billions on defense and all of these different things. But it doesn't mean that they don't have views about what kinds of changes they might like to see. And so we think that people do have views about that. They do have views about which of these spending areas they think should get more money, should get more government support. And so that's that kind of whether you call it intuition or sort of partial preference that people have is the kind of thing that we want to get at measuring.
So one could interpret what you've just said there as suggesting that people's partisan preferences don't have any serious basis at all. But you're not saying that. You're saying that there are underlying preferences of a kind that drive people's partisan preferences, and that's what you're trying to get at here.
So I have views on this, and there are other papers I've written recently that more directly cut to this particular question. I think what I would say is that I think we have pretty good evidence that people have views on some things and not others, and there are relationships between the views that they have on the issues they care about and they've engaged with and their party choices, but that doesn't mean that they've worked out views on everything. And so if you go out and ask a lot of people about the particular issue you care about, it may not be the issue that they care about. And so they may not have worked out views on that.
Sounds like we're going to have you on again, Ben, in order to explore some of your other papers and get into some of the other aspects of this question. But let's get on to your approach in this study. So you're trying to get at the views that people do meaningfully have on matters of budget and spending. So what's the approach that you've taken in this paper?
Okay, so our research design starts from the idea that if people were to try to elaborate what levels of public spending they would like to see across all the areas of government, they would probably start by looking at the current levels of spending, and then they would think about how they'd like to move money around. So they might think about increasing one category of spending at the expense of another, or they might think about raising tax to increase spending in a particular area while not changing the others. Or they might think about lowering tax and decreasing spending in a particular area that they don't think is worth spending on given the tax consequences of that. And so what we did in our research design was focus on 13 high-level areas of spending within the UK government's budget. We focused on areas that were reasonably discretionary. So we didn't look at changing interest payments on the national debt, because that's not something that the government can just decide to pay less on. And we looked at the general tax level rather than looking at individual taxes. So we ran a survey of the UK general population via YouGov, and we asked people to consider randomly generated small changes to those 13 spending categories and overall taxation. So each small change that we proposed to a respondent consisted of 3 of those 13 spending areas changing. That keeps it sort of tractable for someone thinking about it. So in some scenarios, the overall tax level changed, in others, it didn't. So for example, a given respondent might see a proposed set of changes where spending on the NHS went up, while spending on education and defense went down to compensate. And then the respondent was asked if they'd prefer that change to the status quo. So would you like to see spending policy move in this direction, or would you prefer to keep things as they are? Because this is all an experiment and a sort of highly multidimensional experiment, everyone gets a different version of the question. So everyone gets a randomly selected 3 out of 13 spending areas. It's randomly selected whether the changes add up to being tax neutral, tax increasing, or tax decreasing. And we communicate that clearly to the respondent, whether this requires a tax increase, a tax decrease, or no tax change. And the magnitudes of the changes were also randomly generated to be small to medium size so that they were plausible, but so that they weren't all the same. And one of the things that is sort of implicit in our strategy is looking at the effects of those magnitude changes as well. So the sort of the trick, if you can call it that, is taking all of these different survey questions that people answered. No 2 respondents answered the same survey question, and integrating them into a picture of what kinds of changes people in the UK tend to want and which they tend not to want. So this is where the sort of the audio medium of the podcast fails me a bit, as the way we do this involves a fair bit of math that's difficult to communicate here. I guess arguably that's not so much the audio medium failing me as it is saving the audience. But I will try to give the idea of what we did. What those mathematical assumptions, the model, do is enable us to summarize the patterns of responses to different changes and trade-offs in terms of an average public preference over the budget itself. And we can characterize those public preferences or differences in public preferences by demographics. So we can say something about which age groups want more or less spending on a given category, which people with which education levels want more or less spending. We can do that by pass vote and so on. And so we can say things like, on average, people in the UK want to increase spending on health, which is to say on the NHS. We sort of already knew that from previous studies. We see it very clearly in our data, but the way that we've learned that is different than a typical past study, which would have just asked, do you want to increase spending on the NHS? The way we learn that from our data is not by asking about it directly, but by seeing that people tended to like proposals that shifted spending to the NHS from other areas, and they tended to dislike proposals that shifted spending away from the NHS to other areas. And so that it's through those indirect trade-offs that we learn something about which areas people want to spend more on and how much more they're willing to spend. So are they willing to increase NHS spending a bit if that means more taxation, or are they willing to increase it a lot, even if that means a lot more taxation?
Great. So I think even I understood this. So let's just, before we get on to the findings, which are going to be fascinating, I think, let me just make sure I understand how the approach that you're taking is different from and better than previous approaches. So some previous researchers has not confronted people with trade-offs, and therefore we're very suspicious of what the findings are. If you just ask people, should we increase spending on health, and you don't confront them with the possibility that means reduced spending on something else or higher taxes, then you're not getting a response that kind of really reflects what people would think in the real world. And then other studies have attempted to confront people with trade-offs, but in a way that it's difficult for people to get their heads around. So you're kind of giving them the baseline of how things are now and asking them just about changes from that baseline, whereas some other studies have asked people to do something rather more complex. Is that a fair summary of where we are with the methods?
Yes, I think that's a very good summary. On the one hand, you've got studies that ask narrow spending category by spending category, or only looking at tax kind of questions. And on the other hand, you've had a few recent studies where, through the use of an internet tool, sort of people get sat down with the entire budget and asked to sort of say what they want. And I think the major advantage of our approach is that we actually are somewhere in between those, that we bridge the gap between what people might actually have views about, things they like spending more money on, things they think less money should be spent on, their sort of tolerance for new taxes, those kinds of partial views, and the quantitative nature of the budget. So, what we want to do is get people to the point where they express views that we can translate into something that's on the scale of the budget itself. Budgets have to add up. If you spend more on one thing, it has to come from somewhere, or you need to raise more money in tax, or you need to borrow more. And so traditional survey questions have almost never made respondents work within the budget constraints that constrain actual governments. And so they usually do tend to discover, as you said, that people want more spending and they want less tax and they want less borrowing and they want steak and they want ice cream, to use, Lucy's example. But that doesn't tell us much about how people make trade-offs. But when we're thinking about what governments are actually going to do and what they're going to communicate to people, they are going to work within feasible trade-offs. And so what we're learning about through this kind of question is which kinds of trade-offs people will tend to prefer and which they will tend to dislike.
Yeah. Lucy, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in because I think it's important that we don't, too quickly dismiss a third existing approach which is out there, which is trying to take account of trade-offs very much in the same way that we have done, but avoiding the more quantitative, precise way that we've set up our experiment. So there are existing studies that frame trade-offs in terms of, would you like more spending on the NHS? Would you like a lot more spending on the NHS, even if that means a big tax increase or a small decrease in pension payments? But with those, we can never be entirely sure how the respondents who we're talking to are interpreting big or small. And whether that's actually consistent across different people, whereas what we do is we actually give them the kind of pounds and pence amount and the percentage changes so that it's a bit more obvious that this has to add up, rather than thinking like maybe we can make a big increase in the NHS just by a small decrease somewhere else because there's going to be some efficiency saving playing in, or the kind of how people interpret the bigs and the smalls is going to be is just unknown to us, and so we tried to get rid of that element of uncertainty and that element of variation in how we designed our experiment as well.
Yeah. Okay, so we've got the approach, and you've applied this approach by doing this survey in the UK. So we've got evidence from the UK here. Lucy, this is the big and exciting question. What do you actually find?
Yeah, right. So it's important that we ran this in the UK. I think it's also important to flag that we actually were in the field in October of 2018. So that was before Brexit had fully happened. So at that point, we were still contributing money to the EU budget, which we ask about, which we no longer would ask about. But it's also before COVID. So it's highly possible that what we found then, we're quite confident that that's what we found then, but things may look a little different now. But and possibly even then, depending on what your priors are about the impact of the past couple of years, we did find that people want more spending, even when we embed this tax price very explicitly. And also that people want spending to go up by a pretty non-trivial amount. So we, across the 13 categories, we're not talking about the whole of the budget, but it's about a kind of 7% increase on the overall level of taxation that comes out of all of the spending increases added up that people want across the different categories, across the different spending areas.
Yeah, so overall people want higher spending, and they understand that means higher taxes. So this is not a kind of free hit, and you also look at spending across those different policy areas, don't you? And whether there's a kind of the same pattern across all policy areas, or whether people favour some policy areas over others.
Right, exactly. And so, part of the reason that I flagged the timing before as a pre-Brexit survey is because it's not the case that people want to see that 7% increase just evenly distributed across the board. In fact, people want, on average, a relative decimation of contributions to the EU budget. That's like right out, along with overseas aid, which is just not a very popular thing to have money spent on. And on the flip side, we see really, really quite big increases in housing and the environment are the two categories which have the biggest percentage increases. But also health, pensions, and education see very big increases. And those three in particular are three of the largest categories of spending. And so we see people want increases in areas that are already very expensive. And that's really what's driving the overall increase, because where people are happy to cut money, overseas aid, the EU budget, small cuts also to culture and business and industry, those just aren't very big categories. So you can't save a whole lot of money by cutting spending on culture. So then if you want to spend more money, if you want big increases in health and education, you are going to have to increase that overall tax burden.
And how do these preferences vary across the population? I mean, I guess traditionally we would think that people on higher incomes would favour lower spending and people on lower incomes would favour higher spending. So we would think that would be the kind of primary divide here. I was just looking through your data before this, and so far as I could tell, income really has a very small effect on people's preferences about spending. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, I think across income, you do see you can pull out individual spending areas where we can just about, if we squint really hard, see a little bit of the difference of the kind that you just articulated. But really, there are very little preference differences across kind of income categories. Similarly, by gender, we can squint hard and see some differences, but nothing with an obvious systematic pattern, I think. Education as well, maybe there's a little bit more there, but again, it's hard to really have a big kind of single sentence take home. There are categories that people with degrees seem to be more favorable towards than those without, but again, nothing particularly systematic. I think the big dividing exceptions there are to do with partisanship, which we kind of touched on briefly in why we think people have preferences at all. And then even more interestingly from our study, actually age. So it is true in terms of partisanship that people who voted for Labour in 2017 tend to want spending to go up and taxes accordingly to go up, whereas people who voted for the Conservatives in 2017 want to see smaller increases. And as you might have predicted as well, that kind of the EU referendum vote is also consequential, particularly for the EU budget item, also for overseas aid, but also for some of the domestic priorities as well. There are some differences there. And in some ways, we think of this as a thank goodness our measurement strategy actually worked, because if we turned up results that looked very different from that, we might begin to doubt our own tools. But the place where I think we find surprising results that we believe in are to do with age, where kind of maybe counter to what one might have expected, we see older voters preferring much higher levels of taxation and spending. And to put this into context, the margin by which the 55 plus age group wants more spending than the 18 to 34 age group is twice as big as the difference between Labour and Conservative voters. So, if you think of the political divide as being huge, well, the age divide is almost twice that size. So it's really massive. And that's kind of across all of the spending categories other than some of the very small ones, culture, aid, and EU contributions. And so those three small kind of social, international categories are the only ones in which young people prefer higher levels of spending. And on all of the big ones, education, health, pensions, unsurprisingly, older people want to see much, much more spending and are willing to pay the tax costs associated with it, or say they are.
So, Ben, help us understand what's going on here, because this just seems kind of really weird to me. So, people who have been following voting patterns in the UK in the last few years will know that the one big and exciting thing that has really happened, well, one of the big and exciting things that have really happened is a huge age divide has opened up in how people vote. So, young people are far more likely to vote for Labour, older people are far more likely to vote for Conservatives. And yet we have here, young people are far more likely not to favour more spending, and older people are far more likely to favour more spending. So it's all round the wrong way. What's going on?
We think that these results are a reminder that just because parties have clear positions at the elite level doesn't mean that the people who tend to vote for those parties support the party position on every single political issue. Government spending, while important, is not the only basis on which people choose which political parties to support. So to the extent to which the increasing age polarization of UK politics is not really about left-right issues, but rather about Brexit and associated cultural issues. And that's why we see this increasing age gradient in voting from 2010 to 15 to 17 to 19. That we would expect that to lead to greater discrepancies on traditional left-right issues between the parties and the people who vote for them over time. If you realign party politics from left-right issues to some other dimension, you're going to tend to de-align the party positions on left-right issues from those of their supporters. So I think this is sort of consistent with that broader partial realignment of British politics that's occurred over the last 10 years. I think in addition to that general realignment story, that's sort of the classic left-right model of this is going to be a little bit misleading here. We think part of the explanation for the age pattern that we find is that the actual UK government budget just disproportionately goes to areas that support people in old age. So the areas where young people want the government to spend more tend to be relatively small and cheap areas of the budget, like culture, like the environment. The areas where older people want government to spend more are the already large and expensive areas like health and pensions. Education is a little bit of a mismatch to that story, but by and large, it is just the case that the government already spends a lot on the areas which older people wanted to spend more on, and so their preferences are very expensive. And add up to sort of a big change in the overall budget. And I think the other thing that we note in the paper, and which can be read in different ways, is that it is the case that people past retirement age may not personally pay for many forms of tax increases, and therefore may feel the budget tension less acutely than younger people. So when they're thinking about, am I willing for taxes to go up to support greater expenditure on the NHS, higher pensions, they're going to see the benefits of that without necessarily seeing the cost. So part of the, there's always an intergenerational compact in how we spend money and tax to support that. And our experiment does highlight some tensions within that, that people, once they reach a certain age, tend to be beneficiaries of government spending rather than continuing to pay in.
So I guess another idea as to what could be going on here, going back to what we were discussing right at the start, is that, actually people just don't have coherent preferences, and therefore their party's preferences don't relate to their stated preferences about spending in any sort of meaningful way. But you're thinking that's not the case. What you're picking up here in terms of responses to these questions, you think does actually reflect meaningful preferences that people have?
I think if you wanted to use that kind of explanation to explain away our results or to suggest that these don't reflect something meaningful, I think you would need to have a good story for why we see the partisan differences that we sort of expected going in, and those come through in the experiment. But then something weird is happening around age. It's not impossible that you could come up with such an explanation. It could be that younger people and older people are answering the questions differently rather than really having different views. Nonetheless, we think the questions are proximate enough to the sort of the information that people get from the political system, which is, the government is proposing to make these few changes, that they do track the sort of the way information comes to people in the political system, and therefore should still give us useful information about how people would respond to the kinds of changes that get proposed. And unless there's a really big difference in how younger people and older people handle that process that is misleading, we think there's good reason to believe these age differences are real and potentially consequential.
Yeah. Okay. No, that makes sense. That's good. Great. So this kind of research leads to all sorts of questions. I could happily discuss this for another half hour and much longer. Lucy, where are you thinking you're going next with this research? What are the further ideas that you want to pursue further?
Yeah. So actually, I mean, Ben touched on this in saying that the way that we present the costs of these changes may be more salient to people younger than retirement age because of the way that the tax side is structured. But actually, in this work, we do very little to unpack the tax side. It's an overall tax cost that we present as such. And this paper was very much focused on kind of mapping out those allocations on the spending side. Obviously, we can reallocate how we get the money as well. To make it fall more or less on those retirees or on the working age population. Governments can allocate that burden of taxation differently across the various taxes that people pay: income tax, VAT, fuel duty, whatever. And so with a similar kind of guiding principle of making those quite complex trade-offs relatively accessible and backing out population level preferences from answers to simple questions about would you prefer this kind of change or that kind of change, we're actually currently working on a project to figure out where the UK public would most like the revenue to come from if we had to raise more revenue, or where they would most like to get money back if we were able to decrease the tax burden that the government was going to take. The preliminary results, I mean, the spoilers from that paper, some things are not so surprising. People tend to seem to like corporation taxation. They like the higher rate of personal income taxation and the additional rate of personal income taxation. Also, maybe a bit more surprisingly, alcohol and tobacco taxation is very popular. And people really don't like council tax. I think that comes probably as no surprise. But interestingly, VAT, which raises a lot of revenue, is not particularly well regarded as a place to go looking for more money. Although it's quite easy to do that from a kind of 1 decimal point change in the budget kind of point of view. But I think the biggest headline from those preliminary results is that we see really quite muted partisan differences, or really any differences across different groups of people when we're thinking about the tax side and where money should come from, whether that's by income, by education, by all of those characteristics that we've discussed in terms of where people do differ in what they want money spent on. There seems to be much less difference in where people want the money to be coming from.
I'm seeing another future podcast episode exploring those findings further once the paper is out. Thank you so much, Lucy and Ben. This has been really, really fascinating. As I said, I could happily talk about this stuff all day. Really important and interesting material. Hope listeners will want to look at the article as well. It is called Measuring Attitudes Towards Public Spending Using a Multivariate Tax Summary Experiment. Remember, never be put off by a slightly unwieldy academic article title. It's by Lucy Barnes, Jack Blumenau, and Ben Lauderdale, and it's out now in the American Journal of Political Science. We'll put the details in the show notes for this episode, and the article is indeed free for all to read with no paywall, so well worth going there and finding the article. The term here at UCL is drawing to a close, and so this is our final episode for 2021, but we'll be back in January with lots more fascinating and important research. If over the festive period you miss our conversations about the latest politics research, you can find our full back catalogue online, exploring topics as diverse as the state of democracy in the UK, the ethics of education policy, the implications of COVID for conflict around the world, and the politics of climate change. And as ever, to make sure you don't miss out on future episodes of UCL Uncovering Politics, all you need to do is subscribe. You can do so on Apple, Spotify, or whatever podcast provider you use. I'm Alan Rennick. Our producer is Abby Turner. Our theme music is written and performed by John Mann. This has been UCL Uncovering Politics. Thank you for listening, and may you all have a very happy Christmas.